Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining today's DACA meeting for March. Today we have the pleasure of having Mike Felice and Josh Brenneman from BCForward / TapQA to give us a presentation on mobile testing. Just a few little notes. As always, keep your eye on your emails and stuff for getting updates on when our next meeting will be and what the topic will be. We'll still probably be doing this virtually for several more months, so hopefully everybody's able to get on, have no issues or anything like that. And so with that, I suppose I'll turn it over to you, Mike and Josh, so you can get started.
Thanks, Mike. We will get started. Josh, you're going to record or share your screen if possible.
I will do that.
Awesome. So I'm going to take the first couple of slides and then maybe chime in a bit. But for the most part, Josh will be the one doing the presenting. For those of you guys who don't know me, I'm Michael Felice. I was one of the founders and partners over at TapQA. And about 6 months ago, we were acquired by BCForward. And Josh, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, I'm Josh Brenneman, the Solution Delivery Director at BCForward, and came from TapQA. So 10 years of testing, test leadership, and then switching over to more of a delivery role. So supporting, across many clients and our consultants. So that's a little bit about my background.
I'm going to go to the next slide.
I do want to. The question is it going to let me? All right.
Perfect. Josh, did you want to talk about what you're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, I can do that. So this is about mobile. It's I would say it's not a terribly in-depth topic about any one aspect of mobile testing. It's a bit more high level. It's intended to kind of help leaders and testers who maybe haven't done a lot of mobile testing experience, but are getting into it, or if you're starting to have to estimate for mobile projects, or looking at getting some native apps in your organization and kind of want to know some testing tips and tricks. So it's a bit all over the place, but also kind of focused around strategy, and also some just common understanding of the different ways that we can test, the different frameworks that are available, the advantages to Appium open source versus some of the native apps Jim was talking about right now. And then kind of a getting started guide that we're going to walk you through kind of our recommendation for how you can go about being successful in a mobile testing effort.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. Just some quick, just a couple of slides about who we are. So BCForward is a huge, large minority-owned organization out of Indianapolis, Indiana, and we've got facilities kind of all over the nation and the world for that matter. So, and this has been a great opportunity for both TapQA and BCForward to partner together in the fact that we've got a really nice solutions group. And Josh, can you go to the next slide, pretty please?
Yeah.
In our solutions group, there is a huge project management office that BCForward has, and now through some acquisition of TapQA, we're really looking at kind of rounding out what that sort of IT solution set looks like. So that's really been a huge benefit to both BCForward as well as our overall solution. So because Josh and I have always been part of TapQA, we're mostly been very micro focused on quality. And so now we always got to make sure people know that we are a lot more than just quality in terms of our ability to do staffing, contingent labor, and certainly being a diversity supplier has been a big boon for BCForward over the last 20 years. And then the last slide just truly is about, or the next slide is just then truly about us. And again, TapQA was acquired about 6 months ago, and literally almost 6 months to the day. And what we are focused on, we are going to be keeping the TapQA brand, which is great. And we've really been focused on testing and quality assurance, whether that's more manual, automated, API, backend. Those are the micro sort of focused offerings we have, which we still offer today. And some of our solutions have really been around automation, helping folks get started with something that we lovingly call lakeshore testing, which is kind of our counterpart to doing offshore. And then we also do various things around accessibility, design thinking, and CI automation. So that is who we are for those of you that didn't know who we were. And now I'm going to turn it over to Josh to start diving in. And then I think there's a relatively small number of us. So just raise your hand or throw something in the chat. I'll try to be monitoring the chat so that I can bring it up to Josh to maybe take a look at any questions or thoughts that you have.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, so I think, one of the, thinking about what to talk about today, I understand that a lot of this may not be brand new rocket science. Mobile testing has been around for a while. This is not necessarily by itself a hot button topic, but just to, again, make sure we're all on the same page, right? And understand that we're talking the same language. I want to just call out a couple of maybe some familiar and some unique aspects of mobile testing. And this is important just, again, from your estimating standpoint, right? Like we are probably all very familiar with we have our different expertise kind of methods of how we can estimate for projects. And wanted to call out mobile testing, there's a couple of unique things that come to mind that we want to account for later. We'll go into these a little bit more in the parts where we talk about kind of the road mapping and strategy and how we estimate, but just to level set on terms, right? So we have a couple of unique things that aren't considerations with desktop. So interrupt testing. So obviously we're on our app doing some kind of user flow, and we have to account for messages coming in or phone calls coming in. Not rocket science, but again, not necessarily part of our estimate around how we're going to test these things. Is it going to be on each screen? Is it going to be through each user flow? And it's just want to make sure that we get these covered, whether or not it's up to the QA team to do this testing or someone else. Obviously, that's organization by organization kind of make those decisions, but it's a thing and it has to happen. And it can't always happen or can't happen with emulators, right? This is a physical device type of thing we have to do. So I'm going to come back to this kind of theme around our strategy, why we do things a certain way, why we have to use certain strategies at different points of the development process, when we can do, the quick and easy and test a bunch of stuff quickly, and when we have to go back and do it more in a painful, slow manner. So that's why I'm showing the slides, kind of show some of these specific things that we have to think about. And conformance testing, right? A lot of us are used to managing against a calendar around a deployment. And we kind of backtrack and think about, okay, we need a week for UAT here and some additional break fix scoping at the for 2 weeks before we in code freezes. Well, mobile has that stuff too, right? To an extent, but we also have things like conformance testing to think about. And so when we're launching an application to production, right, where it's going out to the app store, the Android marketplace or Apple Play, wherever it's going to come from, there's going to be a lag time between when they get the code and when they're going to put it out available for the public. And also to launch an app, you have to make sure it conforms to their guidelines, right? And Apple and Android both have their own. So again, it's not necessarily that QA has to do this, although a lot of times we end up doing it, but it's understanding that this is a new stage of testing that we have to account for, which is make sure that we're conforming to what Apple says it needs for us to be able to launch on their platform. And then network testing, right? We have that consideration. Again, if QA does it, cool, but how do we account for really slow speeds? So thankfully, there are tools out there that we can get to kind of throttle the bandwidth and be able to check some of those things. But want to highlight some of the unique things that we have to account for. Additionally, thinking about the mobile application test strategy. So just to level set on terms a little bit, obviously we all know what physical devices means, right? We have our iPhones, our Android devices, our tablets, and truly, I mean, the best way to test, the most realistic way to test. And if we're doing this well and doing it right, we do have to have some physical devices in our arsenal, right? And across a variety of platforms. If you're really advanced and you do a lot of mobile work, you probably have a bunch of devices, different different operating systems, right? Like it's a bit more consistent with iOS, but with Android, you have to think about how far back we want to go with their different operating systems, and they all have those funny names. So we want to keep that physical devices. They're great for certain things, but also challenging to be able to test thoroughly and get huge, broad coverage, which is where the emulators come in. And when I say emulators here, I'm not, just to confuse some of the, there's crossover, right, between the different tools. And even though there are cloud mobile tools that have emulator components, right? So think Browser Stack, think Perfecto. Those are a bit not what I'm talking about here, though they do qualify. That's a bit more in the cloud mobile testing tools. Here, emulators here, I'm talking about just the true emulators. And I'll show a slide just a minute that kind of goes through those a little bit more. But also the cheapest way to do it, a lot of open source available. And you can test on a lot of, you can cover a lot of different browsers and different platforms and versions very quickly. And then we have the cloud mobile testing tools, where we do our automation. You can do secured cloud, we can do on-premise, and there's open source, and there's license options, just a lot of different ways to test our mobile applications. So back to the emulator comment and it was kind of rolled up to the bucket of virtual devices, right? And so there's a bit of a can be misunderstanding or not really properly using the terms emulator and simulator. But when you think of emulator, think of like the screenshot that I show here on the screen is an example of an emulator, right? Like it lives usually on your desktop. It could live on a different mobile device as well, but typically it's an install on your device and it runs on through your processor. It's machine code. It's meant to mimic the devices, the hardware and the software that you'll be testing. And you can do a lot with it. And you can test UI validations, you can test the user flows, functionality. They are cost effective. A lot of tools available. You do have to understand that when you say it's an emulator, you might get a bit of an eye roll, right? Like they're not known for necessarily being the most accurate. You can get false positive tests or, it can't replicate it on a real device. And so it's a good idea not just to log everything you see in emulator testing, but does it help you identify scenarios to double check somewhere else, right? Is that when you pull out the physical device to make sure it's reproducible, right? Those kinds of ideas can be helpful. Just understand that emulators are not foolproof. They're helpful, but not necessarily always very accurate. And then simulators don't attempt to do the hardware components. They don't have that kind of display in the button. It's just think about the code, think about the mimicking the behavior of the device, but not the hardware that goes along with it. And then now on to more of the bulk of what this presentation was to talk about the various mobile automation frameworks. And again, there's a lot of I would say just not a lot of consistency all the time and or just general understanding when we say tools like native apps. Like some people don't always understand what that means or what differentiates that. And this is a phrase that I kind of coined just for this presentation, cross-platform open source, right? I'm not saying I invented it, but like I don't know that the industry always calls it that. We actually have gotten so far ingrained with Appium lately that it's almost like we just use Appium to kind of meet as the interchangeable for an open source mobile testing framework. But there are other ones too. Then, of course, there are license tool options. So what I'll do next is just go over kind of the pros and cons of each one and explain a little bit more about the different frameworks that are available. So starting with the cross-platform, the open source. So this is where, a lot of customization is available. You can really architect, almost exactly what you want. And just understanding it has to be built, right? There's a big investment of people, not tools, because it's mostly free. I mean, you can also mix and match and use an open source testing framework like Appium to run the scripts, but then also integrate that with Sauce Labs for environment virtualization. And Sauce Labs is not open source. Or you could go all open source in that scenario and do like a Selenium grid, which will do similar work as Sauce Labs as far as letting you run your code against multiple different environments. There's a lot of support available. It's documented. A lot of people have gotten their platforms to work, and they document the results and they share their code. And again, Appium especially has taken off as kind of the standard, right? The counterpart to Selenium for UI automation on the mobile side is Appium. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Appium specifically. So first of all, language agnostic, right? So that doesn't mean you can do every language with it, but most. So you can be C#, you can do Java, you can do Ruby, Python, JavaScript. So Appium supports all these different languages, which is great because that allows for language parity with what your development team is developing the applications in. So advantages there, and it lives outside of the code. It's a WebDriver technology, so it's very similar to Selenium. If you have Selenium people on staff, they can pretty quickly make the bridge and gap to understanding Appium and be successful in writing Appium tests. Your one code base can be used to test multiple platforms. And like I said, there's a lot of support available. So for being open source, there really is good information to be had. But there are also disadvantages. One is the speed. Appium sits on a layer outside the code and has to be kind of pointed in, and it can be very slow to get through a large test suite quickly. It tends to boggle down. The test code is separate from development code, which is normal, and in some cases, in some reasons, it can be a good thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. The pro of it being, cross-platform, and they can run it one set of code against different platforms is an advantage, but it comes with additional complications, right? Look, if you're going to be able to do that really well, you have to have tight controls over your applications being built to use common IDs, right? Or else your tests aren't going to work correctly either without doing additional workaround. So you might have to have multiple page object models or 2 code repositories, even though in theory it can be shared. In practice, again, if you don't plan it correctly, or if you don't have total control over what your development team is, how they're coding the applications, it may not work the way you just want it to, right? So just keep that in mind. And compared to like a native framework, the tests can be flaky, right? I mean, you have good automators, they're going to be able to fix these issues. But a lot of times, right, especially getting going, you're going to have issues where your second test starts before your last test finishes, and it causes a break or throws an error report, right? So some of that flakiness of automation can be present within Appium. And the native apps do a better job of controlling that. So we'll talk about those next. So what is native testing, right? I think we've heard that term used differently. Some confusion just around, what is native testing? What is native testing? A native application? So just from an industry standard perspective, what we're driving at here when we say native solutions is that these tools are developed by the platform providers, right? And so Apple licenses a tool that comes with the Apple Xcode SDK called Xcode Test that developers use for unit testing, but along in that same kind of code set, Xcode UI Test for QA people or developers if they want, but Xcode UI Test is typically more toward the test team. So they're using a project within the Xcode itself to hold their tests, right? And same deal with Google's Espresso. Espresso is a mobile automation framework designed to be run against the Android applications, and it lives in there within that SDK. So kind of a bit of a newer concept, been around for a couple of years, but starting to really take off to kind of be the gold standard of what mobile automation looks like, right? Like a while ago, Appium was probably the most forefront in people's minds, like the best way to do it. And now you might get a bit of a, okay, we want it, cool, we have some Appium, but we want to shift to native. It's seen as like the next best thing or like the gold standard at this point. So native tools also, just like Appium, they have their advantages and disadvantages. So advantages being performance. They are fast. The code lives right there. It is super cool. The test code lives alongside the source code, all in that same, again, that same project. You can have strong collaboration between the developers and the QA. You know, again, you're within that code framework, and so you can see each other's stuff. Can be really helpful, and it can be advantageous to kind of, you know, separate, instead of doing a cross-platform where one automation test goes against everything. It's a bit easier to work in the confines of a one-for-one, right? So your iPhone tests that you're writing alongside, like the code is it is all right there and like isolated, and you can it's just easier to develop in, to write tests for, and not as much, you know, no boilerplate. Like it's just easier and more pure if you think about what it's doing is all living within the same area, the same source. And it's also pretty inexpensive. And again, there's human capital expenses because this is not easy and takes a certain skill set. But from a licensing perspective, it's like $99 a year. Like the Xcode is free, but to run it against to run it, I think there's a bit of a licensing fee, but it's not bad. The disadvantage to it is that, again, you're very specific, right? So you need all the tests that you do for your mobile, it's only going to work in this case for whatever native platform you're automating against, right? So either it's going to be the iPhone, the iOS or the Android. Resourcing can be tricky. You know, there's a lot of Appium folks in the market. There's a lot of knowledge that's been around. This is native experience is a little trickier to find. And again, like from a budget perspective, can you afford, or can your organization afford, to have not just developers who specialize in a language or platform, but also testers, right? Who can truly specialize and focus on writing XCUI tests only, because they may not be able to do both, right? It's like knowing two languages really well. It's doable, but it's again hard to find. The other challenge that I see, or that we hear about, is that when you're working so deep within an application, right? Like you can write tests and they'll run and they'll pass. It doesn't mean it was necessarily the right test. Like we have to remember to step back to the requirement and make sure the test is doing what we want it to do or what it should do, not just what will work or what we see as what the developer did with his test. So we did it, test ours to get it to pass is obviously just a risk point to call out. So diving just a little deeper, so with the Xcode tests or XCUI, started with version 7. It ships pre-built, it's in there, but it's limited. It's Apple, it's going to be different, right? So we all know Apple's kind of always done its own thing. So that you can only write the tests that you're running in Swift or Objective-C. So again, that skill set, not everyone has this. But it does allow for command line execution. And if you've ever done pipeline work or integration with like a Jenkins, that command line execution is definitely a critical component, or definitely makes things easier for that kind of consideration. Another nice thing about XCUI test is that there's a recorder tool. So there's you can record your actions and have that translate to code that you can then go modify, and it's helpful, especially for entry-level automators, to kind of get that base test code written down. So unique feature, it's kind of cool, worth calling out. And then Espresso, again, the equivalent of that XCUI test on the Apple side, Espresso here for Google's Android. Very stable. The tests, a lot of that stabilization code and weights, right, that are programmed in so your test doesn't run before the last one finishes. Like it's all kind of built in here with Espresso. So you have a very, a very stable, non-brittle type of framework, typically off the shelf, and then which is again just a good experience when you're automating. Not to have some of that other consideration to worry about. this Espresso tool is widely regarded as the fastest way to run tests. I mean, any of the native testing is very quick, including the Apple stuff, but the Espresso has really got the market around tests being able to run, super quickly. And then just a little bit about licensed tools. A lot of considerations are the same that we've probably all considered with regard to desktop sites, your full sites. There's advantages to licensed tools. There's disadvantages to them. There are a lot of licensed tools out there. A lot of the AI and machine learning advancements that have been coming over the past couple of years that we've probably kept an eye on from a testing perspective, and how might these change manual testing. Most of this change is happening within the licensed tool space. There are open source like machine learning scripts and TensorFlows from Google that are available to start thinking about how you can use them in your test frameworks. And we've been successful at doing some of that on the Tab QA side, but but they take that kind of architectural level, or like, really smart SDET type of level to be able to kind of work with those. That cutting edge kind of AI and machine learning, variety is just stronger in licensed tools right now. And so that's just a way to kind of, get there, and can be really helpful. But just like everything else, right? We have advantages, we have disadvantages. So advantages is, one of them is support, right? Like we're automating, we hit issues, we have a system to log a ticket against, and someone else has to look at it, which can be really helpful. We don't have that with open source. We have communities and we have documentation, but we don't have physical a person to support us with our problems. It can speed things up. With a licensed tool, you can get up, you don't have to be as technical to write an automated test. There's native language processing, right, which can translate some test steps into automated scenarios. And you've probably seen some of that with desktop sites and mobile sites, and it's definitely a thing to consider. So you can have help from less technical testers, which is cool. They have off-the-shelf reporting, which can be really, really nice. You can organize all your test artifacts together, so you can have your test cases attached to your test runs, attached to your defects, maybe even requirements, if you can get that to work in your organization, have full traceability. Like, tools allow some of these things, and that can be cool. And you can also get some really good documentation. So if you've ever implemented open source framework, like, you want to tell your architect or your SDETs, like, hey, please comment out some helpful notes here. Like, let us know what it's doing so we can maintain it in the future, or so we can step in, right? If you get hit by a bust scenario, like, it's really helpful. Like, documentation is great. And licensed tools tend to come with more of that, right, than an open source framework. You can get it other ways, but it's nice to have it there. But the disadvantage, it's expensive. You're paying a lot of money for this licensing, right? Not people, but necessarily as much, but the licensing. So there's upfront costs. There's sometimes additional costs to support, right? I mentioned that support is an advantage, but you're paying for it. And then every year, right, you're paying more money. So just the money aspect of it. Maybe even a bigger complication than the money, though, is trying to find talent with a specific licensed tool of experience. Like, it is tricky, right? There's so many tools out there. It probably wasn't as big of a deal back when QTP was the automation tool. You could probably find talent, but there's more tools available now. And finding a specific, I want to find someone who's done test complete, right? Like, implementation somewhere. Like, it's not that's never not doable, but it's just harder. It's harder to find than someone who can do Appium or some other more common tool. You do lose some control because, again, you're having to live within what the tool allows. You can't go and customize it and kind of make it to do what you need, which, again, can be helpful to make things easier, but also be careful it doesn't, like, alter your process in a way that you didn't really intend to, just go to support the tool, right? Like have your processes down, like what's important to you, what are you trying to accomplish? And that should drive the decision around, do we use a tool? Do we do this ourselves? Do we do, get your process down. Don't just get a tool and then have to figure out how to work around it, because that will not be just not a good way to go about your business, your testing duties. All right, so to get started, not that this is always totally follows this pattern and it's not prescribed, right? You will jump around a little bit, but the way I think about getting started is kind of in 3 stages. And that would be, starting off with scope definition. How many mobile applications are we needing to test? Are they applications, or are they browser sites? Are they MDOT sites? Or are they both? So we have to kind of know what all is in scope from as far as like how many and what kind are we talking here. And then back to that first slide, identify the types of testing. So just be clear, if you're having a vendor develop your application, but you guys are doing the testing in-house, well, what exactly are they doing? What exactly are you doing, right? So think about, are you doing interrupt testing? Are you doing the conformance and deployment type testing? Who's doing the performance testing, right? Like all these kinds of considerations are good just to define up front so you can plan accordingly. And then figure out what does success look like in this case? What are we trying to get here? And then the next level of discussion to be had, or things to figure out, is what devices does this need to be tested on, right? So we know how many websites or how many web apps we have to test, but now how many devices are we looking at? Is it going to be Android only? Some companies, that's just their platform, that's all they offer, or iPhone only, but most of the time it's going to be both. And then what all needs to be supported? How many back versions? And then let's think about our automation framework, right? I kind of gave some options around the native, around the open source, around licensed tools. So start getting that plan down around how you're going to attack the automation. It's good to identify your metric criteria up front, and it can be an afterthought, but sometimes that leads to maybe some limitations of data points that you were wanting, but you didn't plan for them. You didn't build that field out in the test case management tool to make an option to be able to report on it later, right? So just think about what kind of reports you want, so you can do your configuration, your planning, and make sure it includes the right data elements to give you what you need on the back end. And then again, based off your velocity goals, whether it's working against a clock of a deploy timeline or a budget or whatever the case may be, think about how many resources you're going to need, right? What's your velocity goals? And then once you have a handle on how many resources you need, that'll help drive some other considerations, right? Like how many people to put toward automation, how many people need to be embedded into the Scrum teams to test the features as they come available. Who's doing the regression test case build out or automation of those cases, right? So all these things we got to help figuring out once we know how many people we have to work with. And then the next level down, think about your test strategy. Again, very similar to desktop, not all of this is mobile specific, but just a good practice. So what is our testing processes? What's our defect management process look like? How do we get test data? Is it manually creating it? Is there automation scripts that we can leverage to populate this data? Is it going to be production and then we do some scrubbing? All pieces that, just like desktop, once you figure these pieces out, you'll have a much more smooth and successful testing cycle. And then also, again, start figuring out, are your test cases going to be run against physical devices, emulators and simulators, large platforms like the Perfectos and browser stacks? How many tests are you going to run per each one? Or do you start off doing very heavy on the tooling, but then want to make sure you get a round of physical device testing in at some point, right? You don't want to wait too long, because if you uncover a big issue, right, you don't want to have to go back and make grand scale changes, but all part of the test strategy, which you have to lay out like just a good way of thinking about how to be successful here. So I think that kind of wraps up the bulk of the mobile testing slides. So I'm going to pause, see if we have any questions. Sorry, in my screen view, I'm not seeing chatter right now. So if there's something, please interrupt. But if not, yeah, feel free to ask a question now.
Josh, I would have interrupted if there was anything in the chat. So you're
Okay.
doing great, and
Okay.
no questions yet. So
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm sounds good. All right. So Mike, I think I'll turn it back to you just to kind of wrap up. I mean, just from my perspective, I absolutely love chatting about test strategy. And so if you guys want to reach out and chat some more, we'd love to hear from you. But Mike, I'll give it to you from here.
yeah, the last thing we just wanted to mention is that we also have a bit of a digital innovation academy. So if there was some more stuff, we'd be happy to talk about that. But it does look like we got somebody to do something in the chat, and I'm went in there and then it came out. Oh, there we go. Josh, the question was, what framework do you find you're using the most?
Yeah, good question. I think we still live in a world, and again, like this is not necessarily a scientific answer, but I think we're living in I think where we are right now is that most of the clients that we work with and companies that we work with have done work in Appium by now, right? Like a lot of times they've in the last couple of years they did an investment in Appium, and that it's working for the most part. I think people are happy with the Appium frameworks that they have, or at least know that there's some steps to take to be successful using that particular tool. But I don't see it as being regarded the same way that it used to, right? Like I think Selenium right now is still very much in favor, and just looked at as the best solution for UI automation, right? I mean, at least as a very good option for UI automation. I feel like Appium's turning into a little bit more of a cool, but how about native, right? I think there's a lot of interest right now in looking at native, and people are starting to plan for it. There's some challenges to it, and sometimes the answer is we're looking at it, but we just don't have the resourcing available with QA staff dedicated to individual platforms like that. So some companies are staying with Appium once they look into what it takes to go native, but that's where the excitement is, in my opinion.
Josh, there was another question about any successes with the two native frameworks, or is it mostly Appium? And then it said, regarding Appium, commonly writing 2 test cases, iOS or Android, or trying hard to make it work for both.
Yeah, great question. So I'm glad that it shows that someone was listening, which is nice. Yes, we do have experience. We do have success stories with native applications, especially. I'd say the reason, or part of the reason they look to us to help with the native frameworks was performance was a big factor for them in wanting to go that direction, and it's definitely been successful. So we've done we have a couple examples. I don't know how many client names to give out on this kind of presentation, so I kind of be vague, but we have. It's definitely a lot of excitement around it. Our architects and estates are again kind of wanting to keep going. It's kind of cool to see. And sorry, part 2 of the question was what, Mike? I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Yeah, no, it was just regarding the Appium, commonly writing 2 tests, or doing we're making it work for one for both. Yeah,
there's a lot of discussion, debate about that topic. I guess for me, it comes down to that kind of control element that I mentioned earlier. So if you are in an environment where side by side, or in one large Scrum team, right? Usually it's going to be 2 Scrum, one Scrum team focused on the iOS and one on the Android side. If you have a lot of control, and you can ensure that developers are using consistent object IDs, I think that would be ideal. I think the maintenance involved would be preferred to have one set of tests that can run against both. But just in the real world that we live in, I think you might spend more of your time trying to get alignment on the page objects, that it might just be better to have two different test sets, right? Or a hybrid approach where you have two page object models, and that can work as well. So I know it's kind of a washy, it depends answer, but I think that's just the reality of the way. The best answer I can give you is, you know, there's the best way, but there's also the real world, and you have to decide which one of those kind of fits your environment more.
You got a good job. Thank you for your honest answers. Good job,
Sweet.
Josh.
Sweet.
Or do you have to generate?
As I was mentioning before, we kind of did a little bit of the Q&A. This is our digital, BCForward's Digital Innovation Academy, and this is just where we've got courses that literally dozens of courses that we offer to organizations, and certainly mobile testing, design thinking, ALM are all part of kind of that Digital Innovation Academy. So if it ever makes sense to maybe look at doing a bit of a more deeper dive, we're happy to discuss that as well. But this is, and that's out on the BCForward.com website as well. So that was kind of the last thing we wanted to touch on. If anyone wanted to kind of do a course or something like that. And then certainly Josh and I are always up for doing like more customized courses or talking with organizations about doing anything more. So.
Mike, I will give you guys the plug that if you go out and sign up on your guys' website, then you will get like the monthly webinar.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Yep. Absolutely. If you go to our TapQA website, certainly you can sign up for our monthly webinar. That's on the TapQA website, and we do kind of a monthly webinar. This month we're going to be talking about data, so just how it affects both project management and testing, and so just kind of the importance of data and decision making, and so that'll be a great presentation, and Mr. Josh will be on that one as well. And then as we look to the future, a lot of our presentations are going to kind of flip-flop between more technical items and then maybe more what I would consider more softer items. And so we kind of go back and forth. But anyways, if you ever have an interest in that, we'll be doing them once a month, usually the last week of every month.
Yeah, I know. I've signed up for a few and they've always been good. Some of them I've had to miss because of other things coming up at work, but.
Yeah, I think somebody had asked about Flutter. Josh, are you familiar with Flutter or not?
No, I'm not. So I'll go check that one out. Is it
Sounds like it's an automation tool of some type.
Flutter Automation Guild Conference? Yeah, sorry, I had not heard of that one. I know I mentioned that there are a lot of tools on the market right now, and I feel like I hear a new one just about every other week. But nope, I cannot shed any insight on that one.
You missed out on Flutter Engage last week. Google was putting that on. It's kind of a new tool that they have combined with their Dart language.
Oh, okay. Very cool.
I was also going to ask you about some additional tools for mobile testing. Some simple things like using proxy servers to just simply monitor your network traffic on your mobile apps.
Yeah.
That's something I see emphasized a lot with some of the different crowdsourced testing websites that they're pushing, like Charles or Fiddler to do some of that.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what that's actually the note I was going to share was Charles Proxy is probably the industry leader as far as I've seen about, for that intended use. Probably are other options, but that's just the one that I've helped. That's one that I've worked with at customer sites. Has been pretty consistent in that it is Charles.
Yeah, I got it.
Well, Mike, no, thank you again. We'll, Mike, I'll send a copy of these slides. I think you're recording this, but
Okay.
that way you guys can send out a PDF of these slides as well.
Oh, awesome. Sounds great. Well, thanks, you guys.
Yeah, no, thanks everybody.
Thanks
Thank
everybody
you.
for attending. And Mike, let me know when you're going to get down so we can get out golf.
You know it.
We'll keep in touch. We'll keep in touch.
Right.
All right.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Josh.
Hi guys, you bet.
Yeah,
Take care.
again, Josh, great job.
బై.
ఇక్కడ వచ్చి
Yeah.
పెట్టున్నాడు నిన్న మధ్యాహ్నం ఏమో నేను చేసిన